Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Oh, good evening, everybody. Hello. If you all take your seats. So, welcome. Welcome to Imperial College for those who are outside, and nice to see you if you're at Imperial College. My name is Martin Seagate. I'm the co-director of the Grantham Institute. Grantham Institute is one of 6 global institutes at Imperial College, and our focus is on climate change and the environment. We're now 10 years old. You can see there's some rolling slides behind me. This is the 10th anniversary of the Grantham Institute, set up by the college all those years ago to be our Imperial's hub for climate change and environmental work. We now count, we've got 25 staff in the Institute, we've got 142 PhD and master's students that we work with, and 196 academic staff that are affiliated to us from all across the college in business, in medicine, in science and engineering. So welcome to affiliates and students and staff if you're with us here. Delighted to host Keith Tuffley for tonight's lecture, a renowned campaigner for climate change awareness and action, and someone who is encouraging businesses to put people on the planet at the heart of their operations. But he's not talking about that necessarily tonight. I'm a polar scientist, I'm a glaciologist, and I'm particularly interested in what Keith's going to be talking to us about. His cycling adventure to the South Pole. I know a little bit about the history of polar exploration, and you're adding to it just a little bit more, so I'm going to be very interested in that. I should say that the lecture is being recorded, and it will be saved on our YouTube channel, so you can hear about it all later. We encourage you to tweet on social media. There is a hashtag, will be up here in a minute. The hashtag is Grantham10, so just use that if you are going to tweet. Before we ask Keith, I'm going to ask David Gann just to say a few more words about Keith, and then we'll start the lecture. David, thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Good evening, everyone. Warm welcome. Many people here, of course, from Imperial and our community, and a warm welcome to visitors from outside. We're delighted that you're able to join, and please come to future events as well. A few words about Keith by way of introduction. Keith's a friend who I've got to know through various routes. Professionally and previously, Keith was Managing Director of Goldman Sachs in Australia and Head of Investment Banking. And after that, had been developing and has developed an amazing organization called the B Team, which is a group of senior business leaders who are inspired to try and change the way that business works to create more sustainable businesses. People like Ratan Tata, Richard Branson, Mo Ibrahim, Mark Benioff are in this network. And I think that's important for Imperial too, because of course we have a business school that does work on the economics of the environment and is thinking about what do we mean by sustainable business. And hopefully, Keith, we can continue conversations with you and your network to expand our horizons in that regard. Aside from the B Team, Keith is an explorer, and I had the fortune or misfortune to get to know Keith cycling in the Alps, and it's a dangerous thing to cycle with someone who's as fit and as competent as Keith is, and he's very kind to wait for me going up the mountains. And just to give some of those credentials, I think, Keith, you're the only person as an amateur who cycled every leg of the Tour de France, the Giro and the Vuelta on the same day as the professionals in the same year, and that takes some doing, as does climbing all or nearly all the 4,000 meter plus peaks in the Alps. The year before you decided to cycle to the South Pole, you skied to the North Pole. So there's something in the genes here about exploration. It'll be interesting to see what you do next. Before you do it, though, tell us what it was like to cycle to the South Pole. So, Keith, over to you.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you, Martin. Very, very kind words indeed. And I would have to say that it really is an enormous pleasure to be here this evening and with so many people in the room. I'm actually quite surprised and humble. Not so humble to ask for a recount for the numbers that Al Gore had here a few weeks ago, but I say that in complete jest, of course. I thoroughly enjoyed the lecture that Al Gore gave, one of my idols for what we're facing as a world. And I've also been a great admirer for the work that the Grantham Institute does, as I have for Jeremy Grantham, as someone with a background in finance and banking and investments. I've admired what Jeremy Grantham has done and the thought leadership that he's provided in the financial world, which desperately needs the sort of change that all of you are showing. But I've also greatly admired the Grantham Institute and the thought leadership that you've provided, the education you're providing to the next generation and the current generation of leaders, and also for the great publications that you generate. And Martin, I will be highlighting I think you'll be very pleased to hear that I hauled a number of these publications all the way to the North Pole and the South Pole in my sled in very heavy paper form. And it acted as my bedtime reading as I was travelling to both the North and the South. I can't guarantee I read all of the ones that I carried, but they certainly made me a lot fitter as I was travelling along. As David mentioned, over the last 3 years, I've had the great pleasure of working with a number of fantastic business and civil society leaders, and really pleased to see that a number of them actually have been former speakers for the annual lectures here at the Grantham Institute. Paul Polman, the CEO of Unilever, Mary Robinson, the former President of Ireland, and Christiana Figueres, the former head of the UNFCCC. And in fact, coincidentally, within 6 hours of arriving at the South Pole, I was actually on a conference call with all three of them as I sat there literally in my tiny tent at the South Pole having a conference call about what we called our Net Zero 2050 strategy, which is about how do we drive the world to a net zero carbon economy by 2050. Little do they know how mentally, emotionally, and physically exhausted I was during that call. So it really is a great pleasure being here this evening in front of this wonderful audience. And let me start by also saying congratulations to you. The leadership that each of you are showing in whatever profession you're in is evident, and it really is that sort of leadership and innovation that we so desperately need to drive towards a zero carbon future and to preserve our environment so we can promote peace and prosperity in this world. Now, I'm sure many of you have either been to Antarctica or been to the Arctic and experienced what it's like being on the ice. You've got your own interpretations, your own experiences. For those who haven't explored the Antarctic wilderness, which is here, I've been asked to give you a sense about what it's like. And that's coming from me. It was my experiences, what it was like being on the ice in a place that is traditionally regarded as just being so hostile to human survival. Now, like many of you, I'm sure you would have had this sort of image of the Antarctic wilderness. Built up over years. I mean, these are fantastic photos from over 100 years ago from Scott's infamous expedition. And from these explorers, true explorers, people who had gone to a place where no one had ever been before, with no form of communication back to their homeland, with no form of survival if they got stuck down a crevasse. These are incredibly brave explorers back 100 years ago. But of course, they built up an image about Antarctica, the Antarctic wilderness. The infamous book, The Worst Journey in the World, which was written by, obviously, one of Scott's surviving team members. And these are the images that I had in my mind. It was truly fearful. The thought of actually going on an expedition from the coast to the South Pole for me was something I actually was quite fearful about. And these images have been reinforced, in my mind, by modern-day explorers who often emphasise the difficulties and the dangers and how tough it is and brutal it is to go to these places. And it is true, it is tough, it is cold, it is windy. But as it turned out, my experiences were very different to that. My experiences actually were, if I can say this, the polar opposite to those images. My images were one of beauty and wilderness and peace and the balance that exists in these wilderness areas. Yes, it was tough, but my lasting memory was actually very, very good and positive images. And this is what I want to portray to you tonight. We all have our own interpretations, our own experiences. But the interpretation I want to give to you tonight is actually about this beauty and this wonder that exists on this very fragile continent. So to head south, where do you start? Well, you start north. That's what we did. We started with an expedition, albeit a shorter one, to the North Pole. And this was for the final 2 degrees on the ice to the North Pole. And this acted for me as an experience and preparation trip to the South Pole. And what I saw there was equally beautiful and stunning, albeit very, very different to the south. Now, in addition to my passion for skiing, as you know now, I love to bike. I've cycled all my life. I thoroughly enjoy it for a whole bunch of reasons. And in recent years, these fat bikes have been created and developed. And I was literally passing a bike store one day where I live in Switzerland, and I looked at it and I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. Wouldn't that be fun to ride on? And it was a moment of madness where I thought, I wonder if it's possible in my trip leaving in 2 weeks' time to go to the North Pole, whether it's possible to take a bike and to see if you can actually cycle to the North Pole. So flew up to this fantastic island of Svalbard, up north, where I was based for a couple of weeks, and had the time then to test out the right mechanism to see if I could pull a sled, because of course it was all about being unsupported, which meant having all your stuff in the sled. Now, as it turned out, the flight onto the ice shelf was delayed because what happens is the Russians put this fantastic airstrip in that only lasts about 2 or 3 months before it disappears into the Arctic Ocean. And it's there for the scientists and the military and for adventurers. So we were delayed in Svalbard, and so I had plenty of time to test out the different ways in which to make it work. But I concluded pretty quickly that it was actually possible. This is the night before we left. This is our last sunset for 2 weeks. Obviously, it was the midnight sun. We had 24-hour sun up on the North Pole. However, after much deliberation, I decided that I wouldn't take my bike. I had other team members for this particular trip. There was a little bit of pressure for me to drop the idea of the bike. They thought I might have slowed down the team members. It was risky, and our team leader was really putting the pressure on, saying, actually, Keith, you know what? I'm not sure if you're being fair on the other team members. Now, to me, the team harmony and the team spirit was far more important than actually taking the bike to the North Pole. So I did decide that actually it wasn't the right moment to do it. So decided to go up there and without the bike. But I'd done what I wanted to do, which was to test the bike on the ice and on the snow that was in Svalbard, and concluded that it was worth pursuing the dream down south. So I'll tell you a bit about what it was like on the North Pole just very briefly. So the 5 of us arrived on the ice now as it turned out, we shortened our trip to 1.5 degrees because of the fact that we got up there at least a week later than anticipated. So we had this beautiful trip from there to the North Pole. Now, as soon as we arrived there, it was immediately cold. I mean, you're going from something like -5 degrees in Svalbard, and you arrive on the ice, and suddenly, bang, it just hits you. It was around -30 degrees Celsius, and when the wind builds up, of course, there's the wind chill factor, which makes about -45 degrees at times. So you just want to keep moving. You just don't want to stop moving. But we did have an unbelievable 2-week blissful ski trip to the North Pole. And again, I just want to highlight just how beautiful it is up there. Now, what really struck me were 3 things in the north. The first was just how amazingly beautiful this simple molecule of H2O can be. I mean, this is just ice that's created naturally by the movement of the sea underneath the ice. And the textures, the colours, the shapes, the sizes. For me, as an amateur photographer, I just loved it because it meant that I was able to, every half hour, stop, take off my gloves for about 5 seconds, take a couple of shots, put the gloves back on for about half an hour, take them off again for 5 seconds. But it really was just the most spectacular ice playground that you could possibly imagine. The second thing was just how much energy is up there, because of course all these ice ridges are formed by the moving currents underneath the ice. The ice is about 3 or 4 meters thick, and it's just created by ice banging against each other. So you end up with these magnificent ice ridges wherever we're skiing, sometimes 4 to 5 metres high. And of course that meant we had to clamber over and around them. Took a lot of navigation to pick the right route. And as you can see here, I just had a lot of fun just wandering around taking photographs of this magnificent ice. But it also meant we had to carefully pick where we pitched our tent each night, because literally these ice ridges can form overnight. It didn't happen to us. We chose our tent locations pretty carefully, but it can happen that in the middle of the night your tent could suddenly find there's a rupture underneath you and you're having to move the tent in the middle of the night. So we had to be pretty careful. The second thing I learnt was how damn good the cycling was to the North Pole. Following 4 big guys with carrying 80 kilogram sleds made this beautiful highway all the way to the North Pole. So yes, I believe I could have actually cycled there, but anyway, that's unfinished business. There's always a good excuse to go back. Now I say this in a bit of jest, obviously, because as you can see here, there were times it was pretty tricky navigating our way around this rubble. We finally arrived at the North Pole. Now, the beauty of the North Pole is there's nothing man-made, human-made at the pole. And the reason, obviously, is because the ice is constantly shifting. My personal ambition, having been with this organisation called the B Team, we played a very active role. The leaders who I acted for played the active role. I was a mere shepherd, moving them around, negotiating with various country leaders during the Paris Agreement negotiations. But I had a personal ambition to be at the North Pole on Earth Day in 2016, which was also the day that the Paris Agreement was signed in New York, following the negotiations in Paris. So we achieved this, and I planted my pole at the North Pole on the Earth Day, which felt good. But the lovely thing is that, yes, there's nothing there. It was just us. There was no one else there. The only way you can find it is with your GPS, to find the 90 degrees, 00000, because it's constantly shifting. And every 10 minutes we found it again, planted another pole, another North Pole, and as you can see here, there's the North Pole floating around somewhere there. So it was quite a funny experience, as you can see here, seeing this. Now keep in mind, the sea ice up there in the middle of summer is around 15 million square kilometres. It's about 40% larger than all of Europe. That's a lot of ice, and let's hope it stays a lot of ice. But you can just see how much energy it is when this entire ice is just shifting around, floating around on the Arctic Ocean. As it turned out, the Russians were very nice to me, because we were picked up by helicopter the next morning, having camped at the North Pole, and they, as a present, delivered my bike to me. So I was able to ride around the North Pole. I chose a spot that was 1 second, either 1 second away from the North Pole, which I think is about 80 metres away, and had a circle around the North Pole and celebrate. It wasn't quite as good as cycling to the North Pole, but cycling around it was nearly as good. So this was a great experience. The next stop was, of course, the South Pole. I would like to acknowledge at least 2 members in the audience here this evening who actually joined me on Ed and Catherine here on the 3rd row, who were fantastic team members. They didn't put too much pressure on me not to take the bike, by the way. They were pretty supportive of the idea. But they were wonderful team members for that trip, and it was a great group of people that were there. So, yes, thank you. 20,000 kilometres later, there we are, the South Pole. Now, this was a very, very different experience. As you can see, the Antarctic continent, it is huge. I mean, this is 14 million square kilometres, again, about 40% larger than Europe and 40% larger than the United States, including Alaska. And we arrived here early December. This was with 2 other team members, Rob and Eric, who were both at the North Pole with me. And we landed at Union Glacier, which is a spot here where most of the expeditions start from. But our goal on this particular trip was to take a new route to the South Pole, one that had never been done before. Now, this wasn't anywhere near the same as what past explorers have done, with the fact that so many people have been to the South Pole. But our ambition was to find a new route and then to pursue it. And that meant, of course, that you didn't know what it was like. We didn't know what the glacial conditions would be like. We didn't know what to find. As it turned out, we found this fantastic route up the most southerly glacier in the world called the Reedy Glacier. And it was just to the west of the original route taken by Roald Amundsen, which was further west of the one that was taken by Captain Scott and his team. And of course, my personal goal was to then cycle it. So my two team members were skiing, and I was to try and test to see if I could actually cycle it. Now, this was a much bigger expedition. It was up to 40 days. We didn't know how long it would take, but we had to take enough food and equipment to last 40 days. The idea here was to take the absolute bare minimum, and throwing out things that we had originally planted in there and doing it time and time again until we could get the weight down. And once again, I tested the bike to make sure that it could actually work on different conditions, different ice conditions. And the plan was, if it was too deep with the snow, I could then put the bike on top of my sled and then ski along. So that was my solution if in fact we found that it was difficult. Of course, that would increase the weight of my sled from 90 grams to 105. But I felt that I wouldn't hold up the team, and that if I really had to carry it, that it would be an appropriate solution. Now, as it turned out, I also promised, you can see the penguin on top of my handlebars there, I'd promised my 9-year-old daughter that I would take her penguin down there. There she is right here. She's unfortunately lost one eye, but otherwise she's pretty healthy. She kept me company the whole way. Actually, you can see on the bike, there was a bit of strapping that I had to put around the front handlebars. In fact, it's not on that particular photo at that particular time. When I got to the start of my cycling, I found this strapping, this plastic strapping, caused this constant squeaking. This So this is my penguin talking to me the whole way to the South Pole. So we then flew out to the magnificent Ross Ice Shelf, and which is this incredibly large but critically important ice shelf in Antarctica. And we flew in there. We took about 8 attempts to land the plane, or at least the pilot took about 8 attempts to land the plane, and then flew off. And then we were in just complete peace and quiet. So this is the Ross Ice Shelf now, about the size of France, heading towards the coast. And we started skiing. I actually put my bike on the sled to start with, thinking, oh, look, it's a bit risky to start cycling straight away. After 5 kilometres, I thought, damn it, this looks pretty good. It was flattish. Of course, there was 300 metres of ice beneath me. And I thought, I'm going to give this a go. And I shot past them. Just went straight past my team members. It surprised me, it surprised them. I was going probably 2 or 3 times the speed as the skiers. And in fact, you can probably see way in the distance there in the top left-hand corner, 2 little dots. That's them about 3 kilometres away. So I just found I could get ahead very, very quickly. And in fact, what we had to agree on was that after 5 kilometres of cycling, I had to stop to ensure I didn't lose them in the distance, and just waited for them. So in fact, this was absolute luxury for me. I just glided along. My sled was just skidding along the ice, and I would literally arrive there. It was nice and sunny. It was about minus 10 degrees, so it was actually quite warm. And I could sit down with my sled, pull out some food, put my feet up, and waited till they arrived. And we did that 4 times a day. On the last section, I was carrying the tent in my sled. On the last section, I would get to the spot. I would erect the tent. I would get inside, pull out my sleeping bag, get out a book, start reading, and waited for my teammates to arrive. So it was a great pleasure. I even actually got out my satellite phone and made a few phone calls back home to talk to my family. So it was a very, very nice experience, this section. After a few days, we got closer to the Trans-Antarctic Mountains, the coastline, and these mountains separate east and western Antarctica, and then started to rise up. So this is now the coastline. So basically 300 metres down is the coast of Antarctica, and started to rise up onto the glacier, the magnificent Reedy Glacier. Now this was a tough part because, of course, what I was doing was going up about a 5 degree gradient And this really tested the legs. You know, the 80 kilogram, the 90 kilograms in the sled was weighing or feeling a lot more than that. Now, at this point, it really was unexplored. No humans had been up onto this glacier. So I just did not know what was around the next corner. For all I knew, I would have to stop the cycling and put the bike on the sled. We really didn't know whether there was deep snow on the glacier or whether it was slippery ice or whether it was crevassed or anything. We just had no idea. So in that sense, it was an exploration. And there was one section here, it took us about, I think, a day and a half to get on top of the steep part. And there was one section I had to put on crampons to clamber on. It was very, very steep. But once on the glacier, it was magnificent. It was this beautiful pocketed ice. So it wasn't deep snow. It was just this great ice that it was pocketed enough for the tyres to grip on, but smooth enough for the sled to slide on. So for me, this was just absolutely perfect. However, there was a very good headwind. And these are the classic, beautiful katabatic winds that literally at 12 o'clock every day would start up. The mornings were great, but at 12 o'clock for about 5 or 6 hours, these winds would just come straight down the glacier. And of course, katabatic winds are driven by gravity. It's the cold air at the top of the continent rushing down towards the coast. And I can say that they do rush. So cycling along without a peloton, it was tough. It was literally, it was hard work for a few hours each afternoon. But we got through that, and each evening about 5 o'clock, the winds would stop and pitch our tent in this magnificent wilderness. And as you can see, we're on both sides of the glacier. We've got 3,000 to 4,000 metre peaks, completely unclimbed on both sides. And this was wilderness at its best. This is the middle of the glacier. The glacier itself is about 20 kilometres wide. It's 160 kilometres long. To put into context, the longest glacier in Europe is about 20 kilometres. The longest glacier is 20 kilometres. So the width of this is about as long as the length of the longest glacier in Europe. So it's a massive piece of ice that's flowing down into the Ross Ice Shelf. And for the next 7 days, this is what we enjoyed. This is what I enjoyed, which was this magnificent cycling on the glacier. And, you know, it's just this vast area. You can see Rob and Eric here pulling along their sleds at snail's pace. They got a good speed. Of course, I was just going a little bit faster. But I was able to basically zip across on both sides of the glacier as I was looking back down onto Rob and Eric. And, you know, for this whole expedition, by the way, all you really see is ice and snow. In this section, you see rocks. You see the blue sky and clouds and the sun. And that's it. You know, you don't see the moon or the stars because you've got 24-hour light. And you certainly don't see planes or contrails or wildlife. We saw no wildlife the whole time because we're too far inland. There's certainly no other humans. And so it's very simple beauty. And this is what we experienced for the next 7 days going up this glacier. Now, this is where a few challenges started. Because after a couple of days, I started hitting a few of these little hidden crevasses. And of course, with skis on, you just glide over these because the skis are 2 metres long. You wouldn't even touch the middle of it. But of course, with a bike, you've got 2 points of weight, and the 2 points, of course, the tyres. And so I was pretty confident about these, just cycling across quite a few of them. And then suddenly, one of them, as you can see here, I slipped down a bit, which is a bit of a scare. This was more of a scare. And this is more of a scare. So, you know, this is the biggest worry now, was the crevasses. Now, by this stage, we're getting towards the top of the glacier. This is after 6 or 7 days. And this is a map of us looking down from where we'd come from. So you can see the crosses there. That's our campsites, 10, 11, 12. The key challenge was between Camp 11 and Camp 12. This is the map we were using. As far as I could work out, this is just Crevasse City. And you know, again, no one had traversed this before, so it was just unknown about what it would be like. And This is a photograph from the 1950s from one of the US military surveying flights. Now, as you can see on the left-hand side here, you can see the open crevasses. At least you can see them. The danger zone, of course, is on the right-hand side because you can't see them. You can see the ridges. You can probably make out a few of the ridges there where, of course, it's snow bridges that are covering the crevasses. And, of course, this is very dangerous because you really had no idea, just how strong those snow bridges were. So this was actually the scary part. Now, this is an example of what we could see. Where the bike is here, it's firm snow. And on the left-hand side, as you can see, it's a very different texture of the snow. And this is where the crevasse was. This particular one was probably about 150 metres wide. So, of course, what I had to do now was put the bike on the sled. We roped up between the three of us, and we just hoped that one of us would get to the other side before me on the back was leaving this side. Now, had it collapsed, I really don't know what we'd have done, frankly, because one person holding, an 85, 90 kilogram man, another one plus 90 kilograms each with our sleds would have been quite frightening. You can get a sense of just how nerve-wracking it was. You can see my marks coming across that particular crevasse as we were coming up it, and it really was quite nerve-wracking. Nevertheless, after a couple of days, you can see the open glaciers, and you get a sense about the depth of it here as well. Now, by this stage, we're about 2 kilometres. We climbed about 2,000 metres. So therefore, the ice was 2,000 metres deep. Now, how deep this particular crevasse was, we don't know. It was hard to peer over the edge and try and see the bottom. But theoretically, it was up to 2 kilometres deep. And of course, we had to therefore do a lot of zigzags across the entire glacier to make our way around these. But finally, after a lot of this navigation and negotiation, we got to above the crevasse fall, and this is us celebrating our first night, Camp 12, and thinking we're there. We've just the first people to successfully traverse the Reedy Glacier. Incredibly beautiful and peaceful. And we thought from here it'd be pretty straightforward now to get to the South Pole. It was pretty much a straight line to the pole. So I was pretty relaxed at this stage. The next day was truly frightening. I was playing around a bit on the bike. I was again ahead of my teammates, and these little mounds started to appear. And stupid me, I decided to ascend one of these little mounds and look back to Rob and Eric. As I ascended one of them, the first 4 or 5 were fine, but this one wasn't fine. And of course, having ascended it going horizontal to the glacier was the worst way you could go. And what happened suddenly was I was facing down this crevasse. And I remember very distinctly holding onto my handlebars, just heading down, head first, and looking down into what this extraordinary cavern of ice. So I had two clear emotions and senses. One was fear, but 2 was the wow factor. I'll never forget just looking down and just thinking, wow, look at this. Now, mixing those 2 emotions together is quite weird, but fortunately, the fear factor got to me more quickly, and I was able to clamber out before I was wowing too much looking down. So I was able to clamber out, and what I did realise was that it really was my sled that kept me aloft. The 90 kilograms, with probably about 2 kilograms of Grantham Institute publications that might have just made the difference to me being alive. So we kept going, and we were now on the infamous, having passed that particular part of the adventure, we're now on the infamous plateau, the magnificent wilderness of the Antarctic plateau. Now, I did say at the start that I was going to highlight the good aspects about the Antarctic, and I will. Having said that, I'll also mention a couple of little challenges we had at this point. And of course, the wind really started to get up. But of course, it created these beautiful sculptures on my bike every morning. So everybody was quite excited jumping out of the tent and saying, wow, what's it done today with my bike? And will I find my bike? Sometimes it really was completely covered in snow. The next little challenge, of course, was what they call the infamous sastrugi. Now, this is for most adventurers and skiers going to the South Pole. This is a bit of a nightmare It makes it very difficult to ski. It makes it almost impossible to cycle. What it does basically was my front wheel going up, my back wheel going down, my sled going up or down at any particular time. It meant I just could not get into a rhythm at all. So I don't have any pictures of me pushing my bike at this point. I should be, to be honest, because I was pushing my bike a hell of a lot. My standard position was like that. Often it was like that. Pulling the bike and the sled over these sastrugi was really hard work. So much so that you can see Eric here repairing his sled. Because of the constant banging, it actually split right through the middle. Fortunately, Eric was a great handyman. He was able to pull out the Kevlar thread and was able to sew it together again. So he had got very, very cold fingers from this particular experience. I must say the fear of that sled breaking up and putting all of his stuff into my sled and Rob's sled, I said, Eric, get and repair that, please. But despite the difficulties, it was actually more beautiful than it was hard. It creates this stunning ice and snow ridges and formations. And again, I spent a lot of time just enjoying taking photographs of just how this formed. And you couldn't create it. I mean, humans couldn't create this. It was just beautiful, natural, and wonderful to see. The next little challenge for me was snow blindness. My goggles fogged up a bit, so stupidly I took off my goggles for one day so I could see something. And of course I then got very, very bad bad enough snow blindness that I was it was very painful for 24 hours. Fortunately, Eric brought out these great goggles, metal goggles with slits in them. So they're actually very effective. I could see out, but they weren't fogging up. So I used these quite a bit to the South Pole. We all suffered from different ailments. Eric got very bad altitude sickness because, of course, we're going from sea level up to 3,000 metres. And he got water in his lungs. He had to stop for 24 hours. We had a very important rest day as a result. And Rob suffered very badly from some leg, ankle and heel pain. And he also lost one of his earlobes from frostbite. Which wasn't as bad as it sounds, but we did enjoy our 24-hour rest day as a result of our combined ailments. Of course, have I mentioned the cold? Of course I've mentioned the cold. It was cold. Here it was about minus 30, 33 degrees. With the wind chill factor, it made about minus 53 degrees at its worst, or its, But having said that, once we were rugged up, we got into our rhythm as we were cycling or skiing, and we're actually quite warm. The first half hour jumping out of the tent, that was hard work, but once you got into rhythm, it was quite manageable. The next little challenge we had was our solar panels and batteries. We had 3 batteries and 3 solar panels. The 3 batteries just didn't work. After about 3 days, we lost our batteries. They just did not work in the cold. And then 2 of our solar panels broke. Left us 1 solar panel. That was it for the 3 of us to charge all of our electronic devices. But I kept thinking back to Amundsen and Scott, and I thought, well, damn it, if they could survive without iPhones and various devices, I'm sure that we can. But of course, it just bonded us together more closely, because every night we were negotiating with each other, how much can we share and swap the energy, the limited energy that we had. How long would Rob be on the iPhone sending off a message to his friends versus me and Eric? So it made quite some fun with our evening negotiations. This is my standard dress. Of course, you can't have any of your skin showing. But of course, by now, the snow had become very, very deep and very, very soft. It was like icing sugar. And it just made it completely impossible for this bike to get anywhere in the snow. So I then had no choice but to put my bike on my sled, admitted defeat. I was not going to get the whole way to the pole with my bike. I'm not sure whether this is unfinished business, by the way. But on this particular route, which was unexplored, there is a nice road that goes to the South Pole, which I'll touch on in a moment. You can definitely cycle that. That's a nice firm distance the whole way from the coast. But for a new route like this, it just made it, unfortunately, impossible to get there. But then we had the final week was this. It was just this dead flat, beautiful, unadulterated Antarctic wilderness. Now, some people love their yoga. Some people like meditation. I personally like skiing 8 hours a day where all you see is sky and snow and the horizon. It's a very therapeutic activity. Again, it's not for everybody, but something that I thoroughly enjoyed. And as you can see, it was just very, very peaceful. We did have some wind, but otherwise it was actually a lovely experience on these final days as we were making our way to the South Pole. We didn't need to navigate with a compass. We could just follow our shadows. Basically, we were timing our ski each day by anchorage time, which meant that we had the sun starting about this angle each morning, and that just circled around us, finishing about this angle in the evening, and then we would stop, and we would just adjust our angle every 15 degrees every hour. That was the way we just navigated. We were able to go straight to the South Pole with that navigation. I'm sure we had a few little turns on the way, but it was pretty effective. And this was our first sign of civilization. This is this little flag that you can see where my bike is parked against, and we saw these little flags appearing on our right. And this was where the flags were planted on this ice road that goes all the way to the South Pole, that services the South Pole with the diesel that's taken in. And we could finally see the stations, the Scott Amundsen or the Amundsen-Scott base in the distance. And finally, we got to the pole, and we succeeded in what we wanted to do, which was a new, unexplored, unassisted expedition to the South Pole, and in my case, being able to cycle it as well. And of course, this was a great feeling of I guess of achievement. But probably the most successful, as far as I was concerned, was the wonderful team spirit we had. I couldn't imagine anything worse than going with some other people where you just weren't getting on the trip. But that team spirit, literally we were having belly laughs every single night in the tent. And that really helped the spirit. It meant that in the morning, getting up and going outside when it's minus 30 degrees was something you actually enjoyed doing. Now, I'll put a little bit of a dampener on this stage, however, that was that we, having got to the South Pole, or just arriving at the South Pole, the first thing that we smelt, was the diesel fumes coming from the generators. And having had 34 days of nothing human at all, clean, beautiful, untouched wilderness, it really struck me. Now, of course, we smell fumes every day. The moment we go outside, we're going to smell fumes. But if you have 34 days in the wilderness and suddenly you smell them, I mean, it really hits you. But what got me most of all was the amount of energy that's down there because of the wind. I mean, we had wind constantly, nearly every day. And yet what we do here for this base is we drill the oil, probably in Texas or somewhere. We process it, we ship it down to the coast. It's then dragged in these barrels all the way to the South Pole, and of course then burned. And of course this is just the irony that we face. Here we are in a place where you could not find more natural, clean, regenerative energy that we can easily source with wind power and solar power. And of course, we're not doing it. It needs investment. Of course, it needs a bit of technology to make sure that it works when you've got, ice that's moving around. But if you can put a telescope in this ice that's 2 kilometres in the ice, which is what the Americans have done, there's a telescope 2 kilometres down in the ice that's a kilometre wide, it's a kilometre cube, basically. If we can do that, I'm sure we can put an appropriate energy system there that's clean. It's not going to save the world or the planet, but it's an analogy, or at least an example of the sort of things the simple things we need to do. The second, and only the second depressing part of the entire trip was actually this. And I mentioned a moment ago the first sign of human civilization after 34 days was that flag. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. So in this unexplored, untouched Reedy Glacier, one day we came across 2 barrels of oil that had just been thrown out of a plane one day, probably back in the 1950s, and just landed on the ice. And again, it's not going to change the planet by picking up these 2 barrels, but it was a sad reminder of how we treat the planet at times, and the fact that we are impacting just about every corner of the of the planet. So what did I learn, having hauled these Grantham Institute and other reputable organisations' publications with me and reading a lot about both the North Pole and the South Pole? Well, there were many things I learned, but one of them was just the sheer volume of ice in the South Pole on Antarctica. Now, it's a simple thing to say. You know, we all know that 90% of the world's ice is on Antarctica. It's a simple thing to say. But when you're there and you actually head down in a glacier, in a crevasse, staring at it, it does give you a new appreciation about what it means. And it really does mean a lot when you realise just how much there is. When you think of a continent that's 40% larger than Europe and it's covered by basically 3, sometimes 4 kilometres of ice, you think, wow, that's a lot of ice that can impact the rest of the planet. In fact, it's so vast, this ice, that it's been estimated that if it were all to melt, that the Antarctic landmass itself, the land that's under the ice, would rise by about 60 metres because of the weight that's actually displaced as a result of that. And again, I'm fearful in saying this statistic to a room. Half of you have got PhDs or are professors, and some of you I know are glaciologists. So I know that I'm saying some facts that may be inaccurate, or at least with different interpretations or different quantities. But there's a massive amount of ice down there. The second thing, of course, which is probably the biggest impact that we're going to be having if we don't quickly get to a net zero carbon economy, is the impact around the world. And I think the latest science indicates that in the next several decades, we could be expecting 1 to 2 metres of sea level rise from the melting of the Antarctic ice sheet. Now, this doesn't include sea level rise caused by the melting of the entire Antarctic ice shelf. This is just what can occur in the next several decades, and also putting aside Greenland, the melting of the ice shelf in Greenland, or the expansion of the oceans caused by the heating of the water. And of course, the ecological consequences of this are enormous. And they're complex when you think about the impacts on ocean currents, the weather patterns, marine food systems, coral ecosystems, ocean salinity levels. But of course, the biggest impact that's going to occur on us as humans is the impact on infrastructure, and probably even bigger than everything would be the creation of climate refugees around the world. When you think about 1 or 2 metres, doesn't feel like a lot. You know, I was thinking when I was catching the tube this morning, trying to talk to someone in the train. Hey, guess what? You know, the Antarctic is melting, and we're facing 1 or 2 metres of sea level rise in the next several decades. Most people would think, that's just either too far away, or it's not that significant. Well, of course, it is very significant when you think about the consequential impacts with stormwaters, many of the low-lying places around the world, including the Netherlands and Florida, and of course low-lying islands around the world. But all of us will be affected by this. There's no question about it. When we have climate refugees, all of us will be affected, no matter where we live. When you think about the impacts that refugees are having on the world at the moment, with all the social and political implications, when we think about what Antarctic can have in terms of climate refugees around the world over the next several decades, it is really quite massive. This is an interactive tool, by the way, that you can go on and actually look at the impacts of different levels of sea level rise. The third thing I personally learned, and I'm not trying to say anything about what I'm telling you, this is about what I learned from my experiences, is the critical role that the Ross Ice Shelf plays itself. And this is something I just didn't appreciate. The Ross Ice Shelf acts as a massive plug, and all these ice shelves do similarly. It's a massive brake that slows down the flows of the glaciers into the oceans, and it can help, therefore, slow down rising sea levels. I hadn't really appreciated that, but as we were cycling and skiing along, you really do appreciate when this 300-metre deep, massive ice plug is acting to slow down the flow of the glaciers. Fourth thing I learned was, and I know there's a lot of research going into this at the moment, is about the impact of warming ocean water and rising sea levels on the speed of the ice melt caused by the melting of the ice sheet from the underside of the ice. And so what's the concern here is that we look at this grounding line, when it slopes in underneath the ice, is that as rising sea levels and warming sea levels have, when that comes down to underneath the ice, is the impact that will have on faster melting of the ice when it's between the rock or between the base and the ice itself. And this is something I completely did not understand or appreciate before heading. Fifth thing I've learned a lot about in the last year or so is just how important climate stability is. Yes, it's heating of the planet, but it's also climate stability. I think we've got a greater appreciation now for the implications of a hotter planet, but a hotter planet, as far as I can see from all the literature, is also causing a more unstable climate and weather pattern system. Humans started agriculture about 10 to 12,000 years ago. And it just so happens that our climate stability really started around that time. Now, we can't go back into history and exactly point out this was the causation, but from what I can read from many of the scientific research is that the ability for humans to have and to develop agriculture and therefore civilization, towns and cities in this time of incredible climate instability would have been just virtually impossible. But we've been living in this Goldilocks period for the last 10,000 years, which has allowed us to evolve human development. And of course, we're about to blow ourselves out from there. And this is what the big concern is that taking ourselves out of this era of Goldilocks climate stability is, of course, a huge concern for us going forward. You would have seen this just the last couple of days, that NASA and a number of other climate institutes have announced that 2017 was the second hottest year since reliable records started back in 1880. And now 17 of the 18 hottest years have occurred since 2001, which is a continuation of the trend. Now just think about that. Let's think if by 2050, 49 of the 50 hottest years occur between 2001 and 2050. You know, it's a serious thought process when you think about the implications of that for the planet. And the sixth thing I've learned a lot about is about these what we call global tipping points. It's not just the fact that we're making a hotter planet, and it's not just about the fact that we're making maybe a more unstable climate and weather pattern system. It's also this growing body of research about global tipping points, whereby a threshold is reached or can be altered because of a relatively small change in the forcing. And even more concerning is that irreversible tipping points, whereby the original system can't be recovered without a very significant change in that forcing. Now, the instability of the Antarctic, the West Antarctic ice shelf, and also the Arctic sea ice loss, they're just two, and the Greenland ice shelf, they're just three of potential tipping points around the planet that we have to be very, very conscious of. I don't pretend to know all of the implications of these, let alone how many of these are valid. But I do, from my reading, it's been a growing body of research around the implications of this. Is if we push it too far, we can get to a situation where we actually can't reverse it. Now, the good news is that there are also tipping points in our human and economic systems. And I'll use two old photographs from the days of Scott and Amundsen to illustrate the point. And this is, of course, the motor car back in 1900 versus, or the horse and cart in 1900, and the motor car literally just 13 years later. So we as humans, we can actually get a tipping point as well, where we can suddenly change, whether it's a technology or a human behaviour or even a thought process about how we can drive change in our planet. And this is the good news. Humans can actually get to a tipping point situation with many of the issues that are actually causing climate change and many other environmental impacts. And of course, we are in the midst of a number of revolutions that are occurring. Now, a lot of my work that I've done in finance and in the private sector, and also more recently with the B team, has been around understanding a number of these revolutions that we're in the midst of. Now, sometimes we don't appreciate them, but our key objective is to get each of these working to a stage where we reach tipping points so we can drive the change necessary before we reach the planetary tipping points. And here's just a few quick examples. Redefining the role of business was the key thing we were doing at the B team. when you think about in the 1970s and 1980s, the Chicago School of Economics thinking, which was the role of business was to make money for their shareholders, that has really flipped enormously in the last 5 to 10 years. And going forward, the role of business should be to actually address many of these human and environmental challenges we face around the world. Obviously, clean energy, clear one. Transport, we know about electric vehicles. I mean, electric aircraft, it's amazing how much new investment is now going into creating electric aircraft. The sharing economy, measurement and accounting systems, the fact that companies are encouraged to externalize their losses and to internalize their profits is a fundamental flaw in our accounting and reporting systems. Impact investing, finally the financial sector is gradually catching up to improve their performance and to realize that finance can be used as a force for good. And of course, we're all consumers. Ultimately, we consume, and we need to make sure that we're improving our consumer patterns. So from my experience, I've also flipped my thinking about my perceptions of the planet. When you think about the role that Antarctica plays or can play in the planet, at times I think we need to flip our entire thinking. And now I know as an Australian, we used to love showing these sort of maps years ago. Oh, Australia's on top of the world. So just park that. It's not about that, okay? It's actually about Antarctica I'm thinking about. And no disrespect to the Arctic either, because the Arctic also plays a critical role in our weather patterns and currents, etc. But we need to remember that if we push the Antarctic over this tipping point of no return, we are going to completely change the look and the coastlines of the planet, and with all the implications that follow. But I'll finish on a good note, which is about the beautiful Antarctic, and this is a fantastic photograph of the Antarctic. And I do want to emphasise a couple of points here, that when Scott and Amundsen travelled there, I don't think they could possibly have imagined just actually how sensitive and fragile Antarctica actually is, which it is. And in my humble view, it is far more vulnerable and sensitive to what we all think. It will have far greater impacts on the planet if we're not very careful, and it's certainly in our interest to preserve it and to keep the ice where it is. Now, I know all of you are committed to this goal. You wouldn't be here otherwise. And all I can do is to encourage you to stay positive and to realise that we've got a big game to play. We've all got a role to play, whether you're a professor or a PhD student or a business person in finance, an explorer, an accountant. We've all got very important roles to play here. Do not let the climate skeptics get in the way. Do not let anyone stop us on this journey. We know where we're going. We're going to the South Pole, or we're going to a net zero carbon economy, and we're going to a net zero environmental impact world in the next several decades. We know we have to get there. So all I encourage you to do is to keep going, keep fighting, get on our bikes and keep pedaling. Thank you. I'll leave Peter for a moment.
Thank you very much, Keith. That's wonderful. Fascinating. I've got loads of questions, but you might have some. But before we get hands in the air, just got a couple of announcements from me before we leave, and that is the next event that we're going to have is on the 28th of February. It's the Grantham Institute 10th Anniversary 2018 Annual Lecture, and it's going to be given by His Serene Highness Prince Albert II of Monaco. So check our website out, see if you can get a ticket. I think they're online. They're probably going already, so do it quickly. You can hear more about the Grantham Institute. You can get Keith's talk's going to be on our YouTube channel, on our website, and you can sign yourself up to our mailing list. Just go to the Grantham Institute website, and you can do all of that.
So can I just say, you saying that I can actually get my children to watch me on YouTube rather than those other crazy YouTubers? Yeah,
it's already done. Questions?
Can I just also say, sorry, yes. I now realise I went well over time, so I won't be offended if there's a mass walkout.
I was going to say, we're going to take questions for 10 or so minutes, then we're going to get a drink. And everyone's welcome. Right? We'll be in the senior common room, so please do that. Question, there was one just there. Yeah, please. Yeah, right.
Sort of a logistical
Yeah, we've got a microphone coming. If anyone wants to ask another question, put your hands up and I'll...
It's sort of a logistical question about biking towards the South Pole. How do you keep your bicycle parts from actually freezing and dealing with the conditions?
Very good question, and it was one that I didn't know the answer to myself before I started, because of course the testing zone for me was Svalbard, which was minus 10 degrees, and Union Glacier, which was about minus 10 degrees. So I had no idea what it would be like in minus 30 degrees with the wind chill factor, etc. So I just didn't know. One thing I did do was I took off my brakes when I was in Chile, and I went down to a bike store, took off my brakes because I just thought they were just unneeded parts. I didn't see myself having to brake. I was doing 7 kilometres an hour, and there wasn't much steep downhill. Getting from the bike store back to my hotel room through the streets of Punta Arenas was interesting. But I finally got there with acting like Fred Flintstone, putting the feet down on the ground and coming to a halt at the lights. But anyway, it worked flawlessly. It really surprised me. The biggest challenge was I had to let down my tyres a lot and pump them up a lot each day because of the change in the texture of the snow. One moment you're cycling on quite soft snow, next moment ice, next moment icy snow ridges. So I was constantly letting up and down the tyres. It makes a huge difference to the performance of it. And the biggest challenge then, of course, was getting the valve off. With big mitts on, it is impossible. So you've got to take the mitts off, get fingers on metal, get the pump out, metal, put that on. A few times my fingers stuck to the pump, and then I had to literally, get it off quickly before they stuck permanently. But the short answer to your question was it worked surprisingly well. I'm happy to promote the company that was. I sound like an advertisement, don't I? But no, they're very good.
Question here.
What are your thoughts on the Antarctic and Arctic the tourism that's taking part now? Like the icebreakers that are going to the Arctic or the expedition cruises to the Antarctic Peninsula?
Yeah. Again, a really good question, because I think, you can go both ways with this, right? I'm personally in the camp where experiences make a huge difference to knowledge and awareness and appreciation about the speed at which we have to move. I don't think you could possibly replace that with just reading a book or with just talking about it. As much as I'd love to think that I've tried to give us some sense about what it's like there, I know it's not the same as, certainly not the same as many other great speakers, but being there makes a big difference. So I'm personally a fan of tourism. I'm certainly a fan of scientists going there and using all the resources possible to conduct the right experiments and tests. But tourism, provided it's done responsibly and properly, I think can make a big difference to people's awareness and appreciation about the issues we face, the vulnerabilities we face, and the action that's needed. That's my view. But I can also be convinced otherwise by certain people who say, no, it's just too much sensitivity in certain places.
Thank you. Nice question. Yes, please.
Hi. I was wondering how much would you say that satellite imagery helped you pick the route?
Yeah. We had a great time with some of the scientists at Union Glacier. It's a big camp there. There's something like 100 people there, and the service provided by the company that runs it is fantastic. So we spent time with some of them, and they had some incredible NASA imagery with technology that I couldn't even repeat now. And what they were what they were doing is they were measuring the speed of the glacier move. So they had to work out where we could land the plane. So if it's on really fast-moving glacier, 30 centimetres a year or something, you wouldn't want to land there because it'd be much bumpier. So we had to find a spot where it was a slower moving part of the glacier. They also tried to estimate where the crevasses were that you couldn't see, but it's very, very hard to measure. But the satellite imagery for the route taken was critical. Again, not perfect, but it was ironic when I was there. You could see the benefits of satellite imagery and the science and the way that NASA and other organisations are working that provide the maps and the tools and the data critical for us to make the right decisions and critical to assess what's happening in Antarctica. So again, I'm a huge fan of the investments being made for satellite imagery and other forms they're using to assess the conditions of the Antarctic continent.
We'll take a final question. Got one over here.
You've
Yeah,
been
please.
to the top of the world and you've been to the bottom of the world. Where are you going to next?
I can't see him. Oh, there you are. Okay. It's a good question. I'm really fascinated by these tipping points on the planet. And there's a number of them, as you can see there. So without giving away my next specific plans, it will be on that theme of exploring these tipping points and seeing how valid they are. I'm not assuming that they're all valid, but I love sailing and I love biking and obviously love skiing. So it'll be a combination of those for the next expedition. But I look forward to coming back one day and telling another story.
Well, we're definitely going to do that. Actually, I've got a question before we break for a drink, and that is: Did you actually see any meltwater on the surface?
No.
Not anything.
No, nothing at all actually.
Yeah.
No. It'd be nice. It'd be nice to say you could see, hey, there's climate change. I wish I could in a way. I wish I could say, look, here's climate change right here. But you realise that's why it's so important for you as scientists who provide the data, because sometimes you can't just come home and say, I saw it today. Now you can certainly see down in the Arctic, because what we saw there was vast spaces there that we were told by the locals this used to be ice, or at least last season it was ice.
When was the time of year that you went?
So we went from early December to mid-January.
Mid-January, right. It wasn't last year, wasn't this year, was it?
No, I arrived back home like this week last year.
Well, it's a good job you did it that time, because this time last year was experiencing a lot of surface melting.
Really?
Very unusual.
Yeah.
You probably wouldn't have been able to do what you did
Really?
if you'd have been there at a certain week. It was 10 days of intense melt around the Ross Ice Shelf. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
No, that's interesting.
Good job
So
you were.
no, that's. I mean, the little just on that little. The day I arrived back from Antarctica last year, I had the misfortune of then going straight to Davos to spend the next 4 days in Davos. I say the misfortune because it really was quite, for me, I was an emotional wreck after that, having gone from pure, pristine, white beauty, wilderness, to Davos. Black cars, arrogance, attitude. It really, I don't mean too critical of Davos. It's some wonderful things being done there, but for me it was a bit of a shock factor having arrived back in reality.
Thank you. Well, listen, thank you, Keith, for that wonderful lecture and talk that you've just given us. I have to say that when you first heard about your cycling expedition to the South Pole, I'm a polar scientist, I wasn't convinced. I wasn't convinced by it. But actually, those pictures of you steaming past your colleagues on the Ross Ice Shelf, I'm starting to get it now. So maybe we should add that into scientific equipment, and we need to be upgraded a bit. But it was a wonderful talk. Fully appreciate the difficulties getting up the Reedy Glacier and getting to crevasses. There are serious problems. Doing science in that part of the world is very difficult, and people do get injured and die in those things. There's a death a year on average in Antarctica, and it can happen. So pleased it wasn't you, but don't underestimate the seriousness of Antarctica. But as you quite rightly said, finding out about these places personally, it actually is so much more evocative than actually reading it in a book, and sometimes you do have to see these things. But thank you also for talking through the important climate science that goes with these things as well. It's greatly appreciated. And as I said, please stay with us. We're going to the senior common room to have a drink. Keith's going to be with us. You can ask him some questions. But until then, let's join me to thank Keith in the traditional way. Thank you very much. Thank you.